America decided Ronald and Nancy Reagan had the greatest love story in presidential history. The photograph proved it. Her eyes locked on him, glowing. The famous gaze. Nancy herself said her life didn't really begin until she married Ronnie. Here's what the photograph doesn't show. Their wedding had no guests, 2 witnesses, a small chapel, a bride who was already pregnant, and a groom who, according to their daughter, phoned his ex-wife first. That adoring wife would secretly run the president's calendar, destroy his chief of staff, and outlive everyone who could contradict her. It all started with a blacklist. In the fall of 1949, a struggling MGM contract actress named Nancy Davis found her name on a published list of suspected communist sympathizers. It wasn't her. There was another Nancy Davis working in Hollywood, and in the McCarthy years, a mix-up like that could end a career before it started. So Nancy went looking for the one man who could fix it, the president of the Screen Actors Guild, Ronald Reagan. She asked director Mervyn Leroy to arrange an introduction, and Reagan showed up to dinner on crutches, recovering from a shattered leg. The accounts of that first meeting don't fully agree. Even her most thorough biographer, Karen Tumulty, found competing versions and declined to pick one. But on the essential point, the record is consistent. Nancy had seen Reagan on screen, decided she liked what she saw, and engineered the meeting. The blacklist problem could have been cleared with a phone call. She wanted the dinner. That instinct, identify the man who represents safety, then close the distance, did not come from nowhere. Nancy Reagan was born Anne Frances Robbins in New York in 1921, the daughter of a touring stage actress and a car salesman who disappeared from her life almost immediately. When her mother, Edith Luckett, went back on the road, she left her small daughter with an aunt in Maryland and visited between engagements. Nancy spent roughly 6 years as the child who got left behind, watching her mother's career come first. Then Edith married Loyal Davis, a prominent Chicago neurosurgeon, and everything changed. Nancy got wealth, status, stability, and she wanted it made permanent. As a teenager, she asked to be formally adopted, took the Davis name, and effectively erased Kenneth Robbins from her biography. It was her first act of image management. It would not be her last. Years later, when MGM's publicity department asked the young actress to list her greatest ambition, she wrote, "To have a successful marriage." She wasn't chasing stardom. She was chasing the thing that had once been taken from her, and she was willing to write the record herself to get it. Reagan, when she found him, was not the confident figure America later remembered. He was newly divorced from Jane Wyman, and crucially, she had divorced him, walking out while her career soared and his stalled. Several biographers describe him in those years as wounded, adrift, and in no hurry to remarry. The courtship dragged on and off for more than 2 years, and it was not exclusive. Tumulty documents that Reagan continued seeing other women well into his relationship with Nancy. The columnist gossip of the era backs it up. Kitty Kelly's 1991 biography went much further, alleging specific ongoing affairs, but Kelly's sourcing has been widely disputed, and those claims should stay in the category of unproven. What's not disputed is the arithmetic. Their daughter Patty was born on October 21st, 1952, 7.5 months after the wedding. Nancy was pregnant when Ronald Reagan finally committed. In a memoir published in 2024, Patty went further, writing that Nancy told Reagan about the pregnancy over dinner at Chasen's, and that he left the table to phone Jane Wyman because he had promised his ex-wife he wouldn't remarry before she did. That detail comes from a daughter writing 70 years after the fact, and it deserves that caveat. But the proposal itself, by every account, was not a scene from a movie. It was 4 words in a restaurant booth. Let's get married. Now look at the wedding, because the wedding is where the myth-making begins. March 4th, 1952. The Little Brown Church in the San Fernando Valley. No press, no family celebration, no guests at all except 2 witnesses, the actor William Holden and his wife, Ardis. Nancy wore a gray wool suit. This was one of the most famous men in Hollywood, the sitting president of the Screen Actors Guild, marrying in near total secrecy, and the reason is not mysterious. A visibly pregnant bride in 1952 was a scandal. A quiet ceremony followed by a honeymoon that swung through Phoenix, where Nancy's parents happened to be, kept everything contained. The couple who would later stand before the world as the embodiment of traditional American marriage began that marriage by hiding it. And here's the part worth sitting with. It worked. For decades, almost nobody did the math on Patty's birthday out loud. The image was already stronger than the calendar. What Nancy entered was not just a marriage. It was a rebuilding project. Reagan's film career was collapsing in real time, and by 1954 he hit bottom, reduced to emceeing a floor show at a Las Vegas hotel, a job he found humiliating and never repeated. The money was gone, the offers were gone, and the two of them were bound together by something the public would never see: shared failure. Then came General Electric, an 8-year contract hosting television and touring the country giving speeches to factory workers, and Reagan slowly transformed from fading actor into practiced political communicator. Through all of it, he wrote Nancy letters, genuinely passionate, devoted letters, hundreds of them over the decades. Those letters matter, and we'll come back to who ended up controlling them. Because the love was real. That's what makes the story uncomfortable. This was not a cold arrangement wearing a romantic costume. It was a genuine attachment that got converted, piece by piece, into a political product. Nancy ran the conversion. When a circle of wealthy California businessmen, Holmes, Tuttle, and the group that came to be called the Kitchen Cabinet, decided in the mid-1960s that Reagan should be governor, Nancy became the filter everything passed through. She vetted the friends, watched the advisors, tracked who was loyal and who was leaking. Reporters covering the 1966 campaign noticed something else. Whenever Reagan spoke, Nancy sat in view of the cameras, eyes fixed on her husband with an expression of total absorption. The press named it the gaze, and it became her signature, mocked by critics, adored by supporters, photographed thousands of times. Keep the gaze in mind. By the end of this story, it will look like something other than adoration. Because while the cameras were pointed at the perfect couple, 4 children were living inside the image. And their accounts of it are brutal. Reagan had 2 children from his marriage to Jane Wyman, Maureen and Michael, whom they adopted. Michael later described, in his 1988 memoir, the day his father gave the commencement speech at his high school graduation. Afterward, Reagan shook hands with a line of graduates. When he reached his own son, standing in cap and gown, he smiled and said, "My name is Ronald Reagan. What's yours?" He did not recognize him. Michael titled his book On the Outside Looking In, and the title was not a metaphor. Patty, the daughter whose conception forced the wedding, put it this way in her own writing. She could not remember ever walking into her family's home with a sense of security or a feeling that she belonged. Her younger brother Ron kept more distance from the public fights, but never pretended the household had been warm. 4 children. 4 versions of the same report. There was no room inside that marriage for anyone else. That's the paradox the fans never wanted to face. The very thing America celebrated, a couple so devoted they seemed to need no one else, was, from inside the family, the mechanism of exclusion. The Miller Center's historians put it plainly. Reagan loved his children, but remained a mystery to them, emotionally distant in a way his own children could never crack. Patty's memoirs went further, describing a mother prone to explosive rages and dependent on prescription pills, allegations Nancy denied, and which rest largely on Patty's word, from books written when the two were estranged. Treat them accordingly. But strip away every contested claim, and the documented pattern still stands. Estrangements with all 4 children at various points, a daughter who wrote a barely disguised novel about a politician couple who treated their children as liabilities, a son who learned about family decisions from the newspapers. And yet, this matters, Reagan kept trying. In a 1996 interview held until after his death, Patty admitted that during her worst years of estrangement, her father constantly played peacemaker, writing her notes, calling, offering reconciliation she kept rejecting. He wasn't a monster. He was a man with a door in him that never fully opened, married to a woman who had decided she alone would live behind it. Nancy said it herself, in her own memoir, and it may be the most revealing sentence she ever published. There's a wall around him. He lets me come closer than anyone else, but there are times when even I feel that barrier. Biographers trace that wall back to Reagan's childhood with an alcoholic father, the boy who learned early to retreat into cheerful performance. So here is the actual architecture of the great American love story. A man who could not be fully reached, and a woman whose deepest childhood terror was being left. She could never completely have him. He could never really leave her. He depended on her utterly, and everyone around them knew it. Divorce was never seriously on the table, not because the marriage was perfect, but because each of them was holding the exact thing the other could not live without. She got permanence, he got protection, the children got the leftovers, and the public got a photograph. For nearly 30 years, that bargain held quietly. Then, on March 30th, 1981, 69 days into his presidency, a young man named John Hinckley fired 6 shots outside the Washington Hilton, and one bullet lodged an inch from Ronald Reagan's heart. The country got the legend version almost immediately. The president joked with surgeons, telling Nancy, "Honey, I forgot to duck." His courage that day was genuine, and it sealed the public's affection permanently. But Nancy's experience of that afternoon was different, and she wrote about it later with unusual candor. The thing she had organized her entire existence around had almost been taken from her in a single second, on a routine day, at an event that hadn't even seemed worth worrying about. The shared crisis pulled the couple closer, and for a while the White House years looked like the marriage's vindication. Glamour restored, power achieved, the gaze on every front page. It looked like repair. It was actually the moment Nancy's need for control went underground and metastasized. Because within weeks of the shooting, Nancy quietly retained a San Francisco astrologer named Joan Quigley, a socialite stargazer she'd first encountered through the Merv Griffin show years earlier. Nancy's question was raw and human. Could Quigley have foreseen March 30th? Quigley said yes. And from that moment, for the next 7 years, the First Lady consulted her by phone, sometimes nearly daily, and used her charts to shape the schedule of the President of the United States. This is not tabloid speculation. The takeoff and landing times of Air Force One, the timing of press conferences and debates, the scheduling of Reagan's 1985 cancer surgery, the timing of the announcement that he would seek a second term. Favorable days for summit meetings. Nancy concealed the arrangement even inside the White House, routing Quigley's payments through a third party, so the astrologer's name appeared nowhere. Ronald Reagan, the chief of staff who had to build the actual calendar around a color-coded chart of good days and bad days, later wrote that virtually every major move the Reagans made was cleared in advance with a woman in San Francisco, and that at times the most powerful man on earth was, in his words, a virtual prisoner of the arrangement. Quigley herself later claimed even more, insisting she'd shaped policy itself. Historians generally treat her grander claims as self-promotion, and her papers, now archived at the Hoover Institution, are read with that skepticism. But the core system, the First Lady secretly filtering the presidential schedule through astrology for most of a decade, was confirmed by the White House itself. Hold that alongside the official image for a second. This is the era of just say no, of the First Lady as the demure, adoring wife who supposedly confined herself to China patterns and drug prevention speeches. Washington insiders sneered at her as a lightweight. They had it exactly backwards. While they condescended, Nancy Reagan was operating as an unelected chief of personnel and, at moments, a shadow scheduler of the presidency. And when the Iran-Contra scandal broke in late 1986 and threatened to destroy her husband, she did not stand by supportively. She went to war. She decided Ronald Reagan was managing the crisis badly and treating her with contempt. He had a habit of hanging up on her, and she methodically orchestrated his removal, working the phones, recruiting allies, pressing her husband for months. In February 1987, Reagan was out, learning of his replacement from a news report. Then she pushed, against the instincts of the political staff, for her husband to do the one thing proud presidents hate: apologize to the country. Reagan delivered that speech, acknowledging that what began as an arms for hostages trade had become exactly that, whatever his intentions, on March 4th, 1987. Their 35th wedding anniversary. The marriage and the presidency had fused so completely that even the damage control ran on their private calendar. In those same years, the surviving record shows, she was pressing him toward symmetry with Mikhail Gorbachev while hardliners in his own administration resisted. Several biographers conclude that the thaw that helped end the Cold War had Nancy's fingerprints on its scheduling and its momentum. The woman in the photograph wasn't gazing, she was monitoring. Don Reagan got his revenge, and in doing so, he accidentally proved how the whole machine worked. In May 1988, his memoir, For the Record, detonated the astrology secret. He called it the most closely guarded domestic secret of the Reagan White House, and the press went into a feeding frenzy. Within days, reporters identified Quigley by name. On May 3rd, the White House was forced to confirm that astrology had indeed been used for the president's scheduling, while insisting it never touched policy. Nancy was humiliated on a global scale, reduced overnight to a punchline. And notice what the episode actually revealed. The only person who ever successfully breached the Reagan image was a man Nancy herself had purged. The fortress had exactly one crack, and she had made it. Her answer was characteristic. She didn't hide. She published. My Turn came out in 1989, the title itself a declaration, and in it she framed the astrology as an emotional crutch after the shooting, admitted the wall around her husband, settled scores, and reasserted control of the narrative in her own voice. Then, history handed her the final, terrible instrument of that control. In November 1994, Ronald Reagan told the country in a handwritten letter that he had Alzheimer's disease and was beginning, as he put it, the journey that would lead him into the sunset of his life. For the next 10 years, Nancy became the sole gatekeeper of one of the most famous men alive. She decided who saw him and who didn't. She called the vigil the long goodbye, and the phrase entered the language. The estranged children came home, largely on her terms. Patty reconciled and later wrote tenderly about her father, and even Michael described a diminished Reagan waiting with open arms for hugs the family had never exchanged in his childhood. In 2000, Nancy published a selection of her husband's love letters under the title I Love You, Ronnie, and think about what that book actually is. The most intimate surviving evidence of the marriage, curated by one of its two participants, released while the other could no longer remember writing it. She chose which letters America read. She had been editing the record since she erased her own father's name at 14. This was simply the masterpiece. She built the afterlife with the same discipline. Reagan's June 2004 state funeral, the riderless horse, the sunset burial at the Simi Valley Library, had been planned by Nancy for years, down to fine detail. The Reagan Library became the temple of the official story, and she governed access to it. She even showed, late in life, that her convictions were her own, and she broke publicly with her husband's party to champion stem cell research, because she had watched what the disease did and did not care whose politics it offended. When she died in March 2016, she was buried beside him on the hillside, under the legend she had spent 60 years constructing, protecting, and when necessary, repairing by hand. Don Reagan was dead, Quigley was dead, Wyman was dead. Nancy had outlasted every witness with a competing version. So look at the photograph again, the famous gaze, the wife lost in adoration of her husband. Everything America saw in it was technically there. The devotion was real. The letters prove it. But the picture was never a candid. It was the public-facing wall of a sealed structure built by a girl who had been left behind once and made sure it could never happen again. A structure that shut out 4 children, ran a presidency through a secret astrologer, executed a chief of staff, and then wrote its own history in widow's ink. The country thought it was watching a woman look at a man. It was watching a director check her shot. Nancy Reagan did not have the marriage America saw. She built the one America was allowed to see, and she was the last one standing when the record was sealed.